Jingari and Kaala. It's great to be here on Commonwealth country and in the year of the United Nations Declaration of the Decade of Indigenous Languages, I like to say Ngari Ninda Murumbayari and Ngali Yinilaba Wunjai, Guraj Jargon, Gulabulabu, Yadnigu Kombameri. And that means you and me acknowledged good talk about this sit-down place that we're on as on the lands that have forever been walked by the Kombameri's people. And I'd like to acknowledge their ancestors, past and present. I'd like to thank Rory and Sean for their opening welcome, and also acknowledge my cousin there, Justine Dillon, Kombameri person who did the welcome for us yesterday, and she's also got Quantamuka links to me as well up there, just the next tribe up. I just want to also acknowledge the Premier of Queensland, Anastasia. Thank you very much for your support for First Nations tourism, the Year of Indigenous Tourism that you've given us 2 years. So thanks very much for that, and it's part of the legacy that you're leaving as Premier as we head towards the path to treaty and the Olympic Games as well, and that provides such an amazing opportunity. First Nations people have been conducting gatherings for ceremony and events for millennia, and so we look forward to helping lead the way for a very successful Games, and from a tourism perspective, wanting to ensure that every visitor that comes to the Games has a connection to country and culture, and that's something that we want to encourage the industry to get behind. I just want to, I think I've got to use my clicker. There you go. There we go. So yesterday was Destination IQ, Destination Indigenous Queensland, and I just reflect back on 2015 when I was at Destination Q and there was only 3 First Nations people in the room. And so it's really pleasing that here we are in 2022 and I can see brothers and sisters out there around here, but also that we've got a lead-in event to this great conference here. Called Destination IQ, and I just want to let you know how Destination IQ came to be about. It just didn't pop up overnight. It was a legacy from decades of work from First Nations Indigenous tourism operators that were an Indigenous Champions Network as part of QTIC. So I want to thank QTIC and continue that Indigenous Champions Network, because from that we have then led into Indigenous forums, beyond employment into Indigenous forums. We developed the First Nations Tourism Plan, and out of that came Destination IQ. Out of that came the request to the Premier for the Year of Indigenous Tourism. Out of that came a $10 million tourism infrastructure fund that Minister Hinchliffe has so diligently utilised and created so many opportunities for our people. And so Destination IQ is the empowerment of the voice of First Nations people in tourism. And that's really important for us as we move towards a voice that in the tourism sector, we've been leading that way. We've been providing opportunities, empowering First Nations people in their voice for tourism. So thank you very much for that from the industry and government. It's been First Nations led, supported by industry and government. And I say that because that's one of the key themes that emerged from yesterday's conference, is that to be successful and get where we want to go, it's about respecting First Nations people and empowering them and letting them work with you as industry and government going forward. So Destination IQ is the leading First Nations tourism conference in Queensland, and I dare say Australia. The conference brings together business leaders, employers, government representatives, tourism organisations, native title holders and community organisations, and thought leaders to discuss opportunities, issues, strategies that are influencing and shaping the operating environment for First Nations tourism in Queensland. This year, the event was themed on shaping the future of First Nations tourism and addresses the 6 pillars from our Queensland First Nations Tourism Plan, which was launched in 2019. Out of those themes, we went through and had a number of panels around that. So one was about recognition and respect. And one of the key themes that came through for us for the sector is that every bit of tourism occurs on First Nations country. So it's about respecting country. And that was the primary thing that for First Nations people, where our identity is, we are custodians in caring for country, culture and people. But if we're not investing in caring for country, then tourism won't operate. National parks are our largest tourism assets. So many joint management arrangements are happening where we have First Nations people now managing country and looking at unlocking that for First Nations, not only cultural and environment purposes, but also economic development and tourism purposes. We were very pleased to have Elizabeth Hackett announce that we're going to have a Destination IQ Young Achiever Award next year. So we're actually looking at how we can talk to our young people and get them involved as well, because our population for First Nations is primarily a majority of young people. So we need to empower young people's voices. And as we head towards 2032 and indeed 2042, we'll be too old. It'll be the young people that are actually going to be running it. So it'll be great to have them involved at this stage. one of the things was about primarily respect. And so we even talked about a pledge. So how does the industry create a pledge for people visiting us to connect with country and culture? And wouldn't it be great if all the officials and athletes from the Games were actually pledging to respect country and culture and doing something to support our First Nations tourism sector? Engagement and partnerships. So one of the announcements we had was that the Queensland First Nations Tourism Council, which is formed out of the Year of Indigenous Tourism, is working with QTIC and Griffith University and University of Queensland to develop a tourism research and innovation hub. And so that was launched yesterday, and I'm pleased to say that already Griffith Uni and UQ have put in 25 grand each, so there's 50 grand for that to commence that initiative. That initiative was also recommended in the First Nations Tourism Plan. We had a great panel of plane trains and watermobiles discussions about infrastructure, tourism infrastructure, and how that can play a role not only in helping support remote First Nations communities, but the role it plays in tourism and truth-telling. We had Minister Mark Bailey on there. We had Margie Osmond from Transport and Tourism Forum. And so it was great to hear about the opportunities for integrating First Nations experiences in our transport area and what they're doing. Queensland Rail, they have wrapped their trains. When you put it on your pass, it's a First Nations artwork. And on the trains, they have digitised images of First Nations people creating the railway tracks. Truth-telling. It's so beautiful, and makes me so proud as a Queenslander when I get on those trains, because I don't have a car. Strategic coordination and structure. So we had a beautiful presentation by Kirsty Birchall from the Indigenous cluster in tropical North Queensland. And what they're doing is developing their First Nations tourism plan in partnership with their RTO. And so that's First Nations-led, supported by industry, and it's funded by Sterling's department as an initiative of the Year of Indigenous Tourism. Just amazing stuff happening, and we're just excited about that's going to be the first one rolling out, and how we can roll that out to regions where we've got everyone working in partnership to drive that forward. Also gave an update on where the Queensland First Nations Tourism Council is at. So it's formed, it's getting its membership, it's looking at advocacy, and it's doing some key projects with Queensland Rail and looking to move forward and work on some of those key projects like the hub, and working with you in industry and government to drive forward our vision that First Nations, Queensland becomes a global destination for First Nations tourism. We also had a Murray Chamber of Commerce update from Adam Williams, which was fantastic. So it's about, we bring together everybody, have an environment where we can have look at really good examples, but also raise those issues and challenges that we have to collectively find solutions for. And so we heard from Adam about the Murray Chamber of Commerce forming, but also some of those issues that we have to overcome as we go towards 2032, and how we can get Indigenous procurement across a whole range of different areas in industry and government. A massive opportunity for us all to take on board. In terms of training, skills and jobs, the Premier talked about our skilled workforce, and it's no different for First Nations people. And we're very pleased that the Queensland Government has released its Queensland First Nations training strategy with Minister Di Farmer. This is such a critical area for First Nations people, not only for helping the tourism sector, but for creating future leaders within our community. We had some great panels where we talked about how we can retain First Nations people, what leadership pathways were, and again, it goes back to that previous point about partnerships. So for non-Indigenous businesses, it's engaging with First Nations businesses to help them. For First Nations businesses, it's about engaging with government and industry to help create a really resilient, strong workforce across our First Nations sector. In terms of marketing awareness, we had a really awesome panel that helped looking at getting export ready. So we had Austrade, we had TEQ, we had Denny Gershwin, Denny G from the Trade Investment Queensland there as well. So that was a really important about actually Destination IQ is as much about educating the First Nations industry about what does it actually mean to be export ready. I don't know. So I asked those questions, and that's really important for us that we establish how we get there. And we had Shannon Rusker, my cousin, who's been around the world travelling and dancing for tourism things, giving the First Nations insight on how we can, if you're a First Nations person, how you can get to that point. And of course, we had authentic product development. So we looked at respectful engagement, and we were very pleased to again launch an industry protocol and guide guidelines for the sector about working with First Nations people in tourism. So that was, we had Brian Barrow speak to that, but it was also great because that was funded out of the Year of Indigenous Tourism as well, another great outcome. So I'm really excited about the Year of Accessibility Tourism because it just has a legacy creating out of that. Not only that, we have such a large, significant proportion of our First Nations people with disabilities, so we're looking forward to continuing our efforts in that area as well. And then creating the unforgettable. The role of arts and culture in tourism. We had an amazing panel. Candice Kruger was singing on stage, and it was Lydia Miller was here talking about some of the festivals that they're creating next year. As we head towards an cultural Olympiad down the track, these are going to be really important. So investing in First Nations arts and culture is going to be critical. We talked about getting all of our First Nations festivals together to have a statewide festival strategy. It's about mobilising, coordinating and getting together and providing those solutions that we can all drive together. The arts and culture is a foundation of where we are, and we need to look at it, addressing fake art. We need to look at investing in our Indigenous art centres across the state and helping our First Nations artists to have that business capacity, so that can come through mentoring as well. It's not just a state responsibility, it's also a federal responsibility, and so we had a really good national presence there, and we look forward to working with local government who are there as well, state and federal, to help driving forward our collective industry. In conclusion, I just want to say that we have the two oldest living cultures. Their homelands are only in Queensland. We've got such magnificent World Heritage areas that we are custodians for, not only us, but we're jointly managing and taking care of them with industry and government. Simply, Queensland is a cultural and wildlife and environmental sanctuary. So it's incumbent on us as the tourism sector to lead. We've got to be the leaders and show that we can have a sustainable sector that is built on First Nations knowledge and culture and environmental sustainability. It's about setting up a future for our children's children. We've still got a way to go. There's vigils around the country where young people aren't even safe walking down the street. So we've got some bad stuff we've got to deal with, but there's a lot of good stuff we're doing. And we've got great leadership on the path to treaty towards the Olympics legacy that we are all excited about. So I just ask you and encourage you to join the party and get out there and help First Nations tourism. Destination IQ was fantastic. I want to thank everyone that attended. It was the biggest one we've had yet, and I'm glad that we can present to you today at Destination Q because we're one big tourism family. Thank you.